In 2013, Japanese researchers examined a block of dried fish that had been sitting in storage for more than 15 years. No refrigerator, no vacuum seal, no preservatives, just dry air, time, and a method so old it was already established centuries before modern food science existed. What they found sounded wrong. No meaningful bacterial growth, protein still intact, and the flavor compounds were not. Weaker, they were stronger. That block was katsuabushi, a piece of fish so hard people compare it to wood, a food made from a cheap skipjack tuna, the kind of fish that should spoil fast in heat. And yet this thing can sit for years and still work exactly as intended. So this is not really a story about dried fish. It is a story about how people, with no electricity and no microbiology, built a preservation system so effective it can make an $800 freezer look weirdly fragile. To understand why that matters, go back to coastal Japan in the Edo period. Huge cities were growing. Edo was becoming one of the largest urban centers on Earth. More people meant more food. More food meant one brutal question. How do you move protein through a warm, humid country before it rots? Fish should have been the perfect answer. Japan had coastlines full of it. Skipjack tuna came in large seasonal runs. It was cheap, available, and packed with nutrition. But fresh fish has a problem so severe it almost feels personal. Catch it in the morning, and in hot weather, you are already racing the clock by midday. That is because fish is basically the perfect short-term paradise for microbes. It is wet, soft, rich in nutrients. Its tissues begin changing almost immediately after death. The flavor shifts, the texture breaks down, the risk climbs fast. So preserving fish for a few days would already be useful. Preserving it for weeks would be impressive. Preserving it for years, without refrigeration, should have been impossible. But somewhere in Japan, over generations, producers kept refining a process that did exactly that. Not by brute force, not by one magic ingredient, by stacking small advantages until the result became almost unfair. And that is the promise of this video. First, I am going to show you why fish is such a nightmare to preserve. Then I will show you the layered system Japan built to beat that nightmare. And the craziest part is not the smoke. It is what they intentionally let grow on the fish afterward. The real enemy here is not fish itself. It is water. More specifically, available water. Fresh fish contains a huge amount of moisture, and microbes love moisture. Bacteria, yeasts, and molds all need certain conditions to grow. Give them water, nutrients, and the right temperature, and they do exactly what nature designed them to do. They multiply fast. So when people talk about preservation, what they are really talking about is war over conditions. You are trying to create an environment where the food remains usable, but the organisms that destroy it cannot thrive. That is easy to say. It is much harder to do when the food is fish, because fish is delicate. Heat it too aggressively and it falls apart. Dry it too fast and the outside hardens first while the inside stays wet. Leave too much fat and that fat can oxidize and go rancid. Miss the timing and you do not get preserved fish. You get expensive failure. Think of it like drying mud. If the outside bakes hard while the inside stays wet, the surface lies to you. It looks finished. It is not. Same problem here. The fish has to dry deeply, not just cosmetically. And old Japan had no electric dehydrators, no lab instruments, no temperature-controlled chambers, no microbial testing, just knives, fire, smoke, sun, airflow, touch, smell, sound, and trained judgment. That sounds primitive until you realize what happened next. Because somehow, with those tools, they solved it. The process starts with skipjack tuna, also called bonito, not because it is magical, but because it fits the system well. It is relatively lean compared with fattier fish, and that matters. Fat is one of the biggest enemies of long storage because fat oxidizes. Oxidized fat means rancid flavor, wasted product, and shorter shelf life. So the fish is cut down into sections. That is not just for convenience. Different parts behave differently. Thickness matters. Fat distribution matters. Surface area matters. Every cut affects how heat and moisture move later. Then comes the first controlled step, simmering. Not a violent boil. Not a rough cook. A simmer. This is where the process already shows its intelligence. The goal is to firm the flesh, reduce microbial risk, and prepare the tissue for drying without destroying the structure. Too much heat and the flesh cracks. flakes, and becomes harder to process. Too little heat and you leave too much biological risk in the system. So this stage does something subtle but critical. It makes the fish safer, it makes it firmer, and it gets the flesh ready for the real battle. Because after simmering, the fish is still wet, still very wet, which means the dangerous part has not been solved yet. It has only been prepared. And this is where most people assume the old method is simple. They picture a rustic fire, a smoky room, and fish hanging overhead until it dries. That image is not completely wrong, but it is way too simple, because katsuabushi is not just smoked, it is smoked in cycles. This is where the method gets smart enough to stop, feeling old-fashioned, and start feeling engineered. The fish is smoked, then removed, then rested, then smoked again, then rested again, over and over, for days and weeks. That resting period is not downtime, it is the whole trick. If you dry fish too quickly, the outer surface hardens before the inside has lost enough moisture. That creates a tough shell around a wetter core. And that wet core is exactly where problems can survive. So instead of forcing the process, katsuabushi makers let moisture migrate outward gradually. Smoke dries the surface. Rest allows inner moisture to move toward that drier edge. Then the next round removes more. It is controlled dehydration, not random dehydration. And smoke is doing more than drying. Smoke leaves behind compounds that help protect the fish. It contributes to preservation. It affects surface conditions. It helps slow some of the chemical reactions that would ruin flavor over time. And little by little, it transforms the outside into a tougher barrier. So now, several defenses are stacking at once. Less available water, a firmer structure, a more hostile surface for spoilage, a slower path toward rancidity, and this is where the product becomes arabushi, the smoked and dried stage. For many producers, that alone is enough. It is already durable, flavorful, and shelf-stable compared with fresh fish. But the highest grade version does not stop there, because the next step sounds like a mistake, and it is the part almost nobody sees coming. They let mold grow on purpose. If you hear that with modern instincts, it sounds insane. You spend weeks drying fish to stop spoilage, then you let mold grow on it? That sounds backwards. It sounds like sabotage. It sounds like the point where the whole process should collapse. Except, this is where katsuabushi stops being merely clever and becomes something else. Because the right mold, managed correctly, does not ruin the fish, it improves it. Over time, producers learned which molds were useful and which were dangerous. The useful ones act like biological finishers. They keep pulling the product toward a drier, more stable state. They help reduce remaining fats that could otherwise turn rancid. And their enzymatic activity contributes to the deep flavor development that makes katsuabushi so famous. That is the twist. The mold is not just tolerated, it is recruited. It becomes part of the system. The block is inoculated by experience and environment, allowed to develop mold, then dried again in the sun. Some surface growth is reduced, then the cycle repeats. Mold, dry, rest. Mold, dry, rest. Over and over. This can continue for months, and by the end, the fish has become something almost absurd. Exceptionally dry, hard enough to clack like wood when tapped, stable enough to last for very long periods if stored properly, and more flavorful than when it started. That final, highly refined form is honkarebushi, not just preserved fish. Fish that has been processed so precisely that age can actually make it more interesting. That is the part that should rewire how you think about old technology. Because this is not primitive preservation, this is layered biochemical engineering done by people who never used those words. But here is what makes the story even more impressive. Katsuabushi was never just a technique. It was a human system. This did not appear because one genius had one lucky breakthrough. It survived because communities refined it over generations. Regions such as Tosa and later Makurazaki became known for production. Families passed knowledge through apprenticeship, not as abstract theory, but through trained senses. A skilled maker learned to judge timing by smell, dryness by touch, surface change by appearance, firmness by resistance, even sound. That matters because the process depends on judgment. At every stage. When has the fish dried enough for the next smoke cycle? When is the surface becoming too hard? When has the mold phase done enough and not too much? When does flavor deepen instead of tipping toward damage? A manual can describe steps. It cannot fully transfer judgment. And that is why systems like this are so easy to underestimate from the outside. People look at the final product and see a hard block of dried fish. They do not see the accumulated observation behind it. They do not see failed batches. They do not see centuries of refinement. They do not see craftsmen learning the exact pace at which nature can be pushed without breaking. Geography helped too. Southern Japan had the fish. It had the trade routes. It had the climate that, while risky, also made the process economically important. Finished katsuabushi could move without refrigeration by boat, by horse, by human labor, across distances that would destroy fresh protein. That may be the biggest practical advantage of all. This product did not need a cold chain. No freezer trucks, no electric storage, no constant refrigeration from catch to kitchen. It could travel stable. And when a food can move that way in a pre-industrial society, it is not just food anymore. It is infrastructure. That is why katsuabushi became more than a preservation trick. It became an industry, a trade good, a taxed commodity. Different grades were known. Different levels of refinement commanded different prices. Simpler smoked versions had their place. The most carefully mold-cured forms were worth more because they delivered something the market recognized immediately. Concentrated value. And the value was not just nutrition, it was flavor. Because katsuabushi did not become important only because it lasted. It became important because it became the foundation of dashi. That light, clear broth sits under an enormous part of Japanese cuisine. Soups, noodle broths, simmered dishes, sauces, layered savory flavors. So much of it traces back to this preserved fish and what it can release into hot water. So one old preservation method ended up shaping the taste structure of a nation. That is a different level of influence. Usually, when we think about preserved food, we think survival, endurance, emergency use. Katsuabushi did that. But it also became culinary architecture. It helped define what good flavor meant inside an entire food culture. And that is why the modern comparison gets interesting. Because once you compare this thing honestly against modern products, you realize the old method was not replaced because it was weak. It was replaced because modern industry had a different priority: speed. So let us compare it fairly. Fresh fish loses almost immediately. Frozen fish depends on electricity. Canned fish lasts a long time, but it requires industrial processing, sealed metal containers, and high-throughput manufacturing. High-grade katsuabushi, properly stored, can remain usable for years. In some documented cases, much longer. That is not folklore. That is durability. A freezer is not portable in any meaningful survival sense. It is stationary and dependent. Katsuabushi is compact, light relative to its value, and does not care if the power grid fails. In terms of resilience per pound, that is hard to ignore. Once most of the water is removed, what remains is highly concentrated nutrition. Katsuabushi is one of those foods that feels almost unfair when you look at it by dry weight. It is not pretending to be a protein food. It is one. A small amount can season a surprisingly large volume of food. That means the product carries not just calories and protein, but culinary leverage. It can make simple ingredients taste fuller and deeper. But modern technology does win in important categories. Speed, absolutely. Consistency at scale, often yes. Convenience for the average shopper, yes. You can buy canned fish anywhere. You can freeze large quantities easily if you have power. Industrial food systems are built for volume, standardization, and throughput. Traditional honkarabushi takes months. That means labor, space, skill, fuel, risk, and capital tied up in a product that is not ready yet. So the ancient method was not pushed aside because it failed the test of effectiveness. It was pushed aside because modern markets reward faster turnover. That is a huge difference. Faster is not the same as better. It is just easier to scale. And the moment you look at the world through resilience instead of convenience, the old method suddenly looks much smarter again. That is the bigger lesson hiding inside this fish. We like simple stories about technology. Old equals primitive, new equals superior. Katsuabushi breaks that story in half. Because this was not an early, clumsy version of refrigeration. It was a totally different philosophy. Do more work up front. Use time as part of the process. Accept slowness in exchange for durability. Build a product that survives transport, storage, and uncertainty with very little outside support. That sounds old. Until the power goes out. Until supply chains fail. Until refrigeration becomes expensive. Until you realize a lot of modern convenience is really just dependence wearing good branding. And suddenly a hard block of fish from an old Japanese process does not look quaint at all. It looks resilient. That does not mean everybody should replace modern storage with katsuabushi. That would be silly. It means old systems sometimes solve the same problem under harsher constraints, and in doing so, they created strengths. Modern systems often traded away. And this is where the practical question kicks in. If someone watching this wants to try it today, what do they actually buy? Start simple. If you are outside Japan, the easiest entry point is katsuabushi flakes. They are widely sold in Asian grocery stores, Japanese specialty shops, and online. Look for labels that clearly say katsuabushi, dried bonito, or shaved bonito flakes. Avoid confusing it with instant dashi powder if what you want is the real ingredient. Flakes are convenient, but they are not the full experience. A whole block is closer to the traditional form. It also keeps better because there is less exposed surface area. Once something is shaved thin, oxygen and humidity can attack much more easily, so flakes lose aroma faster after opening. If you buy a whole block, you usually need a shaving box or specialized tool. That extra effort is exactly why most people never experience fresh shaved katsuabushi, but the flavor can be noticeably better. Now here is the beginner move that ruins it. They boil it aggressively. Do not do that. For a delicate dashi, the water should be hot, not violently rolling. Add the flakes, steep briefly, and strain. If you hammer it with a heavy boil, the result can get flatter, rougher, and less elegant. That sounds like a minor mistake. It is not. With a product this concentrated, small handling choices matter. Storage matters too. Humidity is the enemy. Keep flakes sealed well and use them reasonably fast after opening. Whole blocks are more forgiving, but they still need dry storage. This is a preservation product, not a magical object that survives every environment automatically. And one more honest point. Katsuabushi is amazing, but it is not a complete survival food by itself. It is protein-dense, yes. It is shelf-stable, yes. It is flavor-packed, absolutely. But it is not a full nutritional system. It does not replace fresh foods. It does not preserve other foods by touching them. It is not some miracle cure for bad storage habits. It is a highly refined ingredient, which makes its real strength even more interesting. It was designed to solve one problem extremely well. That is usually what the best technologies do. So now go back to the beginning. A cheap fish, a humid country, no electricity, no refrigeration, no microbial. Science. And somehow the answer was not one dramatic invention. It was a chain of controlled steps. Simmering, smoking, resting, drying, mold curing, patience, observation, repeat, that is. What makes this story so powerful? It reminds you that innovation is not always about inventing a new machine. Sometimes it is about understanding a material so deeply that you can guide nature without fully naming the chemistry involved. That is what katsuabushi really is. Not just food, not just fish. A preservation system built so well that later generations, surrounded by compressors and plastic and powered cold storage, can look at it and still feel slightly uncomfortable. Because deep down, it forces one annoying question. If this old method worked so well, how many other technologies did we dismiss just because they were slow? And how many of them were not inferior at all, just operating by a different definition of success? So here is the challenge. If you can find real katsuabushi this week, try the simplest version possible. Hot water, flakes, nothing else. Taste it before adding soy sauce, before salt, before anything. Then answer with one short phrase. What did it remind you of? Because once you taste what this process actually does, it stops feeling like a weird old Japanese ingredient. It starts feeling like proof that some of the smartest technologies on Earth were built long before modern people gave them proper credit. And in the next video, we are going deeper into that same world, because this fish was not the only ancient Japanese solution that quietly outperformed the modern product replacing it.